Mr. President, I have literally grown hoarse coming to this floor defending the rights of Americans poisoned by their own government to be compensated by that government when, through no fault of their own, they have been exposed to nuclear radiation, nuclear waste, nuclear contamination in the soil, in the water, in the air. And I just listened to my friend from Utah describe this 11th hour bill after the Senate has spoken to this issue multiple times, Mr. President, multiple times. After that has been done, now my friend from Utah comes and says we need a clean extension. A clean extension. Clean. Well, there's nothing clean about this bill. No, it leaves Missouri filthy, dirty with nuclear radiation. Let's just remember how it happened. All the way back in the Manhattan Project, the United States government used the city of St. Louis as a uranium processing site. And did the United States government clean up the nuclear radiation after the fact? No, it did not. Did the United States government warn the people of Missouri that they were in fact being poisoned by nuclear radiation? No, they did not. What they did instead is they lied to the people of Missouri. While the nuclear contamination seeped into our groundwater, seeped into our soil, for 50 years and more, the people of St. Louis and St. Charles and large parts of my state have been exposed to nuclear radiation. We have the highest rates of breast cancer in the nation in North St. Louis County. Entire schools cannot go to school because their classrooms are filled with nuclear radioactive material. And what has the federal government done? Not a thing. What would this bill do? Not a thing. Would it clean it up? No. Would it clean the lungs of the survivors who even now are dying from the poison they've been exposed to? No. Would it clean the areas of the Navajo Nation that have been overrun with nuclear radiation? No. Would it clean the mines that our veterans went to for decades exposed to nuclear radiation? No. No, it would do none of these things. And this bill, I think, partakes of an entirely different philosophy. It's the philosophy expressed by the junior senator from Utah, Mr. Romney, who said recently, it's too expensive. It's too expensive for the federal government to actually make right what it has done to all of these good Americans for decades on end. No, instead, what we need to do is pass this bill that the senior senator from Utah is now advocating. It's a small fraction, he says. He's right about that. And it's reserved for those individuals who have been determined to have actually suffered. To have actually suffered. So let's just be clear. If you live in Missouri, you are not deemed to have actually suffered under this legislation. If you live in New Mexico, you are not deemed to have actually suffered under this legislation. Heck, if you live in Utah, you're not deemed to have actually suffered. Is there any expansion for the state of Utah in the legislation proposed by the senior senator? No, there's not. Mr. President, we have been here before. We have been here for months. We have been here for going on years now. Senator Lujan and I have passed through this chamber not once but twice legislation that would reauthorize this critical program and finally do justice to the hundreds of thousands of Americans poisoned by their own government, and this body has passed it twice, the last time by well nigh 70 votes. The time now is to act. It is not the time for further delay. It is not the time to look away. It's not the time to change the subject. It is the time for the House to act. Study after study has shown the expanse of the nuclear radiation. Here's a study from 1997, from 2005, another from 2005, from 2023, all showing that the nuclear radiation is far beyond the contours of the original RECA bill passed in 1990. And yet my friend from Utah wants to just keep on doing the same old thing, leaving out in the cold hundreds of thousands of Americans. I will not consent to it. Mr. President, this body will not consent to it. We have been here before. We have had this debate. We have settled it. And this is not the time to reopen it. This is the time for the House to act. No more excuses, no more delays, no more changing of the subject, no more blaming of the victims. This is the time to stand up and be counted, for the House to act. Before I object, Mr. President, and I am going to object, I want to yield to my friend, the senator from New Mexico, who has been such a champion in this fight. Mr. President, for a year now, Senator Lujan and I have been coming to this floor and warning that the Radiation Exposure Act is going to expire. And that's why this body took action, not once, but twice, in overwhelming bipartisan fashion, to expand and extend RECA in a way that does justice to every American, every veteran who has been poisoned by their own government. And now it is incumbent upon the House to act. And I want to be clear. I will not consent to any short-term stopgap, to any halfway measure. I will not give my consent to it. It will not pass this floor with my consent. This body has acted. This body has spoken. And there can be no turning back now. We're not going to turn our backs on the victims, not any longer. It's been 50 years in the state of Missouri. It's been just as long in New Mexico. It's been just as long for the Navajo Nation. It's been just as long for the uranium miners, our veterans. There can be no going back now, Mr. President. And so I object.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I think now I've heard my friend from Utah change his position. Now he's saying he is willing to acknowledge that there needs to be an expansion of coverage for the people of Missouri, for the people of his own state, for the people of New Mexico. I'm glad we've gotten to this point. I'm glad we're willing to acknowledge finally that indeed there are those who have suffered, Americans who have been poisoned by their government, who've never been compensated, and it's basic justice to compensate them. I think that's now the position that we're at. It's taken us a long time to get there, but I think that's what I now hear the senior senator from Utah saying. I think I also heard him say that cost should not be used as an excuse. Let's just be clear about something. The cost has been paid. It's been paid by the victims. Who is it who's paying the medical bills? The victims are. Who is it who's having to choose whether to do a cancer treatment or be able to afford school supplies for their kids? The victims are. Who are the ones who are having to decide whether they can afford the burial services or not for a loved one who's passed away because of nuclear radiation? The victims are. They're the ones bearing the cost. The United States government's gotten off scot-free. 50 years, the U.S. government hasn't paid a penny in my state, in New Mexico, the Navajo Nation, in Arizona, to the miners, our veterans. Nothing. Nothing. They're the ones who made the mess. In Missouri, it's still not cleaned up. As I stand here on this floor, Coldwater Creek, still poisoned. The Westlake landfill, still burning. Weldon Spring, not cleaned up. Government hasn't done anything. And I'm glad to hear an acknowledgement, finally, that it is time for the federal government to take responsibility for what it has done. We can all agree on that. We can all agree that the time to act is now, which is why this body has acted. It's done everything Senator Lee has just talked about. We've done it. We did it months ago. Months ago, the senator talks about getting this done today. It's been done. The Senate has done it. We passed this bill with nearly 70 votes months ago. I urge the senator to use his good offices in the House to speak to Speaker Johnson, who pledged, by the way, to the Congresswoman from Missouri, Ann Wagner, in a public statement. He said the House would take this up and make sure RECA is renewed. I believe the senator's right. They've got 18 days. 18 days. He made a commitment. Let's keep our commitments. I urge the senator to use his good offices, now that we all agree, to get this done in the United States House of Representatives. That's where the obstacle is. But I reiterate, I will not be party to any attempt at some halfway measure, some short stopgap bill, or some effort to sweep this under the rug. Not anymore. The victims have waited too long. They've waited too long.